This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to our second water talk that we've done so far. My name is Blake Aldridge. I'm the Water Education Coordinator here at the Upper Trinity Regional Water District. If you're not familiar with us, Upper Trinity is a regional drinking water and wastewater treatment utility based in Louisville, and we currently provide drinking water to over 360,000 people in Denton and Collin counties. During the summer months, which are going to be here soon, outdoor irrigation accounts for up to 70% of our total water use, um, particularly this last year. And we know that much of that is wasted due to inefficient irrigation systems and just overwatering, just using too much water. So today we're joined by Dr. Becky Bowling, assistant professor and urban water specialist and a turf grass expert with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Center in Dallas. Dr. Bowling's will talk to us about other important aspects of lawn care, in addition to proper watering to make your lawn healthy and happy all year long. Just a couple housekeeping things. Um, be sure if you haven't to mute your mic so that we don't disturb the presentations, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. Um, but if you have a question, you can write it in the chat box, and we can look at that at the end. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Bowling.
Thank you, Blake. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. I know it's always, lunch hour is a precious time, so thanks for spending it with us today. We're going to talk about a lot of different things today. I'm sure you guys will have questions, and so I look forward to getting to those as we move through the presentation. So, when I do these talks in partnership with some of our water districts, one of the things that I really like to speak to, we'll talk a lot about efficient irrigation practices, water conservation, but we also like to focus on watershed protection, water quality protection when we talk about lawn care behaviors as well. So kind of thinking about the fact that anything that we do in the landscape or on the lawn, has the potential to move off of our property and go into our streams, our rivers, our lakes, etc. So it's just good to kind of be mindful of this. We'll talk about some best practices today related to nutrient management in particular. Just remembering that everything that we put out on our property has the potential to impact things beyond the boundaries of our property. And so the decisions that we make in the landscape, they do matter. I like to focus on this because it reminds me that even if I have a very small yard, I can have an impact on the ecosystem and community that I live in through the plants that I select, through those irrigation practices, and through the other inputs that I bring into my landscape. For example, you may not have known that nitrogen inputs alone often exceed demands in urban ecosystems, primarily home lawns, by as much as 51%. So it's not unusual when we have conversations about fertilizer contamination or nutrient pollution in water for there to be a lot of focus put on big ag. But increasingly, we're seeing with growing urbanization and cities getting bigger and bigger, that particularly in and around urban areas, these watersheds are significantly impacted by just home lawn fertilizer practices, right? It's very easy for me to go to a store and buy a bag of something and put it out. And we may see that sometimes we tend to overestimate how much fertilizer some of these yards and gardens may actually need. So we'll talk about some of that today, and what are some of the implications of this? So you may or may not have known that, in particular, with certain fertilizer products, we may be concerned about nitrogen and phosphorus movement into our watershed. And there's a lot of different ways that that movement can occur and a lot of potential impacts of that movement. And I talk about this because, again, it's very easy for us to go and buy a fertilizer product, and we may not know that how we apply that fertilizer could have implications for water quality in the area. So We may see, for example, that nitrogen can actually leave our property in a gaseous state. We refer to this a lot of times as oxidation or volatilization, depending on the type of movement that we see, and it can actually contaminate the atmosphere or be redeposited into our surface water through rainfall. We may see that a lot of fertilizer products, nitrogen and phosphorus in particular, can run off of our property. So, we know that here in North Texas, it's not unusual, right, for us to get a very heavy rainfall event that can lead to significant runoff, or for us to sometimes see irrigation done in a way that leads to significant runoff. And so you can imagine, as that water is moving over our turf grass lawns, moving over our gardens and landscapes, that it may pick up nutrients, bacteria, and other contaminants and carry that into our stormwater, into local streams, rivers, etc. And the consequences of this, can be variable. But one common consequence we may see, for example, is something called eutrophication, which is where we get an accumulation of phosphorus and nitrogen and other nutrients in ponds and lakes and rivers and streams. And it can lead to big algae blooms and other aquatic plant life growing in such a way that they actually consume the oxygen in the water and can create dead zones where we see dead aquatic life or dead fish in that water. In addition to that, we sometimes see that these fertilizer products, if they end up in our drinking water, can be linked to certain health concerns. So, it's all of this to say that, yes, fertilizers are plant food. And they can positively contribute to our landscape, but we want to be conscientious about how we use them and be sure not to over apply them if possible, and do everything we can to keep them on our landscape where plants can use them and take them up. All right, so let's kind of get started here. We're going to talk about several different things today. One topic I'm not going to get into too much today, but I'm happy to answer questions about it, is going to be turf grass selection. We do get some questions about this in the spring, and like I said, I'm happy to talk about that more as we get to the end. I could do an entire 2-hour class just on turf grass selection. We're going to dive right into management practices today, and we're going to focus a lot on mowing, fertilization, irrigation, and then at the end, we'll talk some about pest management as well and try to hit those major areas. But like I said, if you guys have questions about selection at the end, we can definitely get to that. So first thing we'll talk about today is going to be mowing, because even if we may not fertilize or may not irrigate our yard, most of the time for us to think of it as a turf grass stand, well, at the bare minimum, we will be mowing it to maintain a particular height. And the purpose behind mowing is going to be to have a certain aesthetic or look that we're going for. And a lot of times this may be partially governed by local ordinances or HOA bylaws, for example. And we also tend to mow at a particular height to support certain functions. We want it to be tall, short enough that my little dog can get out there to use the bathroom, or my kids can go out and run around with it, or in that turf without tripping, or without there being certain other hazards associated. And mowing, it seems like a practice that we don't need to put a whole lot of thought into, but it's actually a very easy practice for things to go wrong, and for us to start off at a disadvantage in terms of maintaining a healthy and resilient turf grass lawn. And so there's a few basic things that we want to make sure that we're going for with mowing. The first is that typically with a lot of our warm season grasses, with any of our turf grasses, we want to, in a lawn scenario, be on the upper end of the recommended mowing height range. And this doesn't necessarily mean do not mow, but what it does mean is, I'll show you guys some ranges here in a second for different common species of turf grass that we grow in lawns here in Texas. And when we stay on the upper end of that, meaning we let that grass be a little bit taller, we're going to see several potential benefits from that. So the first is that taller grass is going to typically be more competitive with weeds. It's going to shade out the soil to prevent weeds from germinating and emerging. And the other thing, which is an even bigger thing, is that with any of our plants that are growing in native soil, we're going to see a relationship between above and below ground growth. All right. And we refer to this a lot of times as the root to shoot ratio. So if I let my turf grass be a little bit taller, I'm typically going to see that correspond to deeper roots below ground. And as a general rule of thumb, the primary thing we really want to try to create in our lawn is deeper, healthier roots. When I have deeper, healthier roots, I'm going to be more drought tolerant. I'm going to be more cold tolerant. I'm going to be more traffic tolerant, and I'm going to have overall a more resilient turf grass system. So we really want to try to encourage that through our management practices. And one of the first things that we can do to support deeper root growth is to have this little bit taller mowing height. And when we get those deeper roots, it's going to offer other benefits to us as well, like improving how much water our turf grass lawn can capture when we get a rainfall event. So if we have areas of the landscape where roots are very shallow or where we don't have good plant materials, these are typically areas that don't absorb water as well as areas that have really good established plants and deep root systems. And so, with the type of rainfall that we get here in North Texas, we want to try to capture as much of that as possible. And similarly with our irrigation, we want to try to prevent runoff as much as possible. So this is from a publication. It's available on our website, which is agrilife.learn.edu. And you can download this and it'll give you an overview of best management practices for mowing. So it has some text in there that talks about, the basics of mowing. Why do we do it? What are some considerations? And then it's got this table in here that kind of breaks down several of the common grasses that we grow here in Texas and the appropriate mowing height ranges for those grasses. And you'll see in these two columns over here at the end that we've got kind of two different mowers outlined here. So we can get away with a little bit shorter mowing height on some of these grasses if I'm mowing frequently with a reel mower. But most of us at home are going to be using a rotary mower. And with a rotary mower, we typically recommend a little bit taller mowing height. And again, in a lawn scenario in particular, we typically recommend a taller mowing height anyways, because most of us aren't trying to maintain a golf green at home. If we go too short with some of these turf grasses, we're going to be having to supplement that or help them along with more fertilizers, more water, more frequent mowing. And this is not very sustainable and something that's just typically not recommended or needed when we're talking about a lawn. So a couple things I want to point out here. I would say in terms of where I tend to see folks mow things too short, it's going to be two primary species of grasses that we see here in North Texas. Oh, whoops. So the first of these is going to be St. Augustine grass. Many of us may have a St. Augustine grass lawn here in North Texas, and that's going to be the very coarse, thick-bladed, thick textured grass that's very dense. And it's not unusual for us sometimes to see folks try to mow this at a very low mowing height, much like they would mow Bermuda grass. So we may see folks try to mow it at 2 inches or less. And this is not something that we recommend for this species of grass because it's so coarse, because it's so thick and big. It does better typically when we have a taller mowing height. So for example, with my St. Augustine grass yard, typically in the spring as it greens up here in the Plano area, I may start off the season by mowing it at about 2 to 2.5 inches. And then as things start to warm up more, I increase that mowing height over time. And usually by the time I get to June or July, I have a mowing height of about 3 to 4 inches on that St. Augustine grass, which is taller than a lot of my neighbors. And what I notice every year is that as we get into August, my yard continues to stay green and lush, while their yards, which are mowed at a much shorter height, tend to start to look browner and more stressed. And it's because they don't have those deeper roots. There's a little bit more stress put on that plant from that lower mowing height in general. So a little bit taller mowing height is going to be a good practice. Another grass where we sometimes see folks try to mow too short is going to be buffalo grass. If you happen to have buffalo grass or a native turf grass lawn that has buffalo grass included, when we try to mow buffalo grass too short, similar to St. Augustine grass, it tends to not tolerate that very well. We also tend to see it open up, get more weed issues. So feel free to take a little picture of this, or again, you can look for our mowing fact sheet on agrilife.learn.edu and download a copy of this for yourself. Now, once we figured out our appropriate mowing height, the other thing that we have to take into consideration is our mowing frequency. And so many of us may be on a mowing schedule with a landscaper, or we may just be on a personal schedule where we're outside in the yard, once a week or once every 2 weeks. Generally, as a best practice, what we recommend for mowing frequency is that you only mow, that you mow sufficient to only remove about the upper third or 30% of that above ground growth. And so in other words, what that means is if I go out and let's say that my ideal mowing height is 2 inches, right? And I wait until it's 4 inches tall and I go out and try to lop off the upper half of that, I'm going to put my turf grass in stress. And during that time that it's in stress, I'm going to create opportunities for weeds to move in, for other pests to move in, and I'm going to make my turf grass less tolerant of heat and stress because it's trying to make up for all of that good leaf tissue that I just took off of it. And so if my mowing height goal is around 2 inches, I typically want to get out there and mow by the time or before the time that it reaches 3 inches in total height. And this is going to help ensure that I'm following this 1/3 rule, not removing more than 1/3 of that height at any point in time so that I'm not overly stressing that turf. And unfortunately, what this means is that because our growing pattern tends to change throughout the summer in response to temperatures and rainfall, your mowing frequency may need to change in response to that. So some weeks you may have to be out there once a week in order to follow this 1/3 rule, whereas many times by the time we get into July or August, you may hardly have to be out there at all, right? Because we'll see a lot of times these turf grasses significantly slow down when we get too hot. Another mowing question I get from a lot of folks is whether or not to mulch their clippings. So should I just let my clippings go out onto the turf? Should I bag and remove them? So generally, as long as your turf grass is healthy and you're following the 1/3 rule, meaning you're not removing 6 inches of material at one time, mulching your clippings is beneficial. Your clippings are very nutrient rich. They contain a lot of additional nitrogen. When you mulch those clippings and allow them to fall back onto the turf, they will break down, and a lot of that nitrogen, sometimes as much as 50% or more, will be available for your turf grass to take up again. So you're essentially recycling those nutrients in the system, which reduces how much fertilizer is needed to keep your turf grass healthy and happy. Now, if we're in a situation where we have a significant weed issue, significant pest issue of some kind, or our mowing height is out of control, then those are exceptions where we may bag and remove those clippings. For example, particularly when weeds are flowering or producing seed, and my goal is to prevent the dispersal of that seed, then that's a time that I would bag and remove those clippings and treat them almost kind of like biohazard material, or maybe repurpose them, put them in a compost pile where I can get those temperatures up to sterilize those seed. But as a general rule of thumb, when we're doing everything else well, mulching your clippings is a beneficial practice. If you do mulch or return your clippings, you will want to basically complement this by reducing how much you're fertilizing at the same time. So if I'm fertilizing at pretty high rates or pretty high frequency, and I'm also mulching my clippings on top of that, I may experiment with cutting back on my fertilizer by 25 or 50% over the growing season. And if my turf still seems pretty healthy and happy, then that's a good sign that it's getting more than enough support from these clipping returns and the lower amount of fertilizer that I'm providing. All right, so once we've kind of gotten through our mowing practices, the next thing that we talk about a lot is going to be irrigation and watering. And it's really important that we try to stay present and connected to this here in North Texas. Water is a finite resource. We have a lot of population growth happening here in Texas, and it's putting considerable strain on our water resources, and that's not going to slow down anytime soon. And if we're not careful with the way that we use water, we will very quickly find ourselves in a position of not having enough water to support the population as it is now and as it's continuing to grow. And so, what we see, unfortunately, a lot of times with watering here in Dallas, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I grew up in this area and continue to work in it and drive around it a lot. And what I can tell you is that a lot of folks have a bad habit with their sprinkler system of setting it and forgetting it. they program it, or they have someone else program it, and they never look at it again. And as a result, we see a lot of folks watering in the rain. We see a lot of folks watering after we've gotten 7 inches of rain. And this is just not an effective use of our water, which is a precious resource. And so, I'm going to talk about some basic tips today, recommendations for you as you go out and you think about your sprinkler system. One of the first things that a lot of folks may or may not know is that here in the state of Texas, a person may not sell, design, install, maintain, alter, repair, or service or inspect an irrigation system or consult in these activities unless that person is licensed by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. So what does that mean? It means that there is a professional license regulated by the TCEQ as it relates to contract work for irrigation systems and sprinkler systems. And so in a nutshell, you should not be hiring or paying anybody to look at or service your irrigation system in any formal capacity unless this person has a license from the TCEQ. And, does it mean that you can't go out and, make some swaps or some minor repairs to your own sprinkler system? No. But certainly if you're paying somebody, or if you're considering a major overhaul of that system that'll involve trenching or the addition of new components, that's something where really a licensed irrigator should be consulted. Now, if you moved here recently from another state, this is kind of unusual. There's only 4 states in the U.S. that actually have an independent license for irrigation contractors. There's 5 others that have a subcategory license that falls under, for example, a plumbing license or something like that. But it's not every state. There's not many states necessarily that do this. And so Texas is a little bit unique in this regard, but it is important. And what you see here is actually a homeowner search option through the TCEQ that allows you to put in your zip code or put in your city, and it generates a list of licensed irrigators in your area. And there's a couple of other resources that do this as well. So I can tell you that, for example, the Dallas Irrigation Association has a similar search feature, and the Texas Irrigation Association also has a similar search feature. Even if you find a contractor on one of these websites, it's good practice to confirm before you employ them that they actually do have this license. Now, once we have consulted our licensed irrigator, the next thing that we're going to want to do is get to know our sprinkler system a little bit. And I think as part of the water series that Upper Trinity is hosting, there are going to be other programs that go into this in more detail. But there's a couple of basic things that I would encourage you to kind of check in with as it relates to your sprinkler system. The first is understanding how water is actually being applied, because not all sprinkler heads are created equal. And the type of head that you have can have create significant differences in terms of what's an appropriate run time, for example, to put out a certain amount of water. And so typically in the landscape, we're going to see water applied through one of 4 primary mechanisms, which I have kind of outlined here. Now, that doesn't mean that within these, there may not be a million options from different irrigation manufacturers, but typically if I go out, I'm going to see one of 4 things. Okay, so very common for us to still sometimes see in sprinkler systems this first option, which is a fixed spray head. These are, typical pop-up sprinkler. When you look at them from a distance, it's going to look potentially kind of misty, very small droplet sizes, and they tend to put out a lot of water in a short amount of time. Now, that sounds maybe like a plus, but typically we actually view that as a negative, because those of you that have played around in our soils here in North Texas know that our soils are not the most absorbent soils. They're not the most receptive to water. So when we have a sprinkler system that's putting out water at a very high rate in a very short amount of time, our soils are usually not going to be able to take a lot of that up, and we're going to see a lot of that run off. Okay. And in addition to that, you can imagine that a sprinkler head that produces very small droplets here in North Texas, where we tend to have a pretty decent wind speeds and high temperatures in the summer, that there's going to be a pretty good risk of evaporative losses. So what you're looking at with this first option, it's still sometimes the default option for some irrigators that are trying to irrigate a particular area. And it may have been a very popular option at the time that your sprinkler system was put in. But if we're talking about efficiency, of water application, this is not a particularly efficient option. You're going to have a greater risk of evaporation and a greater risk of runoff if you have these heads. Okay. And so as an alternative, what we can actually swap to fairly easily, there's some things you want to pay attention to, and there's some good resources and videos online that can speak to this, but you could swap a lot of times from these fixed spray heads to a multi-stream rotary nozzle. So you've probably seen these before. You may have these in your landscape where they produce these streams of water. We're going to see larger droplet sizes. And we're also going to see a lower precipitation rate. So it's putting out less water over the same time frame as that fixed spray. And again, that's actually a plus with many of our North Texas soils. We want water to be applied low and slow. We want to be as close to the ground as possible. We want the droplet sizes to be as large as possible. And we want that water to be applied as slowly as possible so that our soils, which are very heavy and fine textured soils, have time to absorb and take up as much of that water as possible. And so, a lot of times we may also see these referred to as high efficiency nozzles or high efficiency spray heads. We have some cities, for example, that offer rebates if you make the swap from your fixed spray to the multi-stream rotary. So that's something that's worth exploring. And we may see that these multi-stream rotary nozzles are 20 to 30% more efficient than the fixed spray. Now, what's important to point out about this is if you do make that swap, or for example, I had somebody in a program last week who told me that, the heads, they have the fixed spray in the front yard and the multi-stream rotary in the backyard. Because we're putting out water at a slower rate, your runtime is going to be very different between these two. So this woman that was in my program, she said something like, well, I run every zone for 10 minutes for both the fixed spray and the multi-stream rotary. And what that means is she's probably putting out twice as much water in her front yard as opposed to her backyard because of how different these different sprinkler heads are. And so that's why I'm saying, one of the first things you can do as you go out into your yard next is to figure out what kind of heads you have, because that's going to have a big impact on appropriate run times to put out water for your yard. Now, next to that is going to be a rotor head. This actually has gears built into the head, and this is going to be a very similar option in terms of efficiency to the multi-stream rotary nozzle, but we'll see that these rotor heads are going to cover a larger area typically. So we'll see these are very popular options if I'm on a golf course or a soccer field or something like that. Then next to that, I have drip irrigation. And drip irrigation is a very popular option. It's a very efficient option to go into landscape beds, vegetable gardens, and we are seeing increased popularity and increased adoption of what we call subsurface drip in turf grass lawns. So if you're in a new development, you may have drip in your yard where they've actually laid drip lines underneath your turf grass. So that's becoming a fairly popular option as well. Now, for those of us that do have an in-ground sprinkler system or in-ground drip irrigation system, there's several things that we want to focus on. First of all, irrigation systems are designed to supplement water when rainfall is not available. So again, we really want to avoid a situation where we are watering during a time period where we're really receiving sufficient rainfall to keep our plants healthy and happy, and that irrigation is not needed. We also want to make sure that if we are using a sprinkler system or an in-ground irrigation system, that we're programming them to be as precise and efficient as possible. So we want to minimize evaporation and we want to minimize runoff as much as possible. Kind of getting back to this comment that Blake made earlier, if we have as much as 70% of our potable water being used outdoors, and as much as 50% of that is never even being taken up by plants, a lot of that is because, we don't necessarily have the most efficient sprinkler system design or the most efficient technology or the most efficient scheduling in place to really be as efficient as possible with that water. So common problems that we see, certainly overwatering is a big one. We see a lot of folks tend to overestimate how much water is really required to keep a landscape healthy here in Texas. So we'll kind of speak to that a little bit today. We will see issues with improper design and installation. There could be mistakes made in the initial installation of an irrigation system, or we may see that a sprinkler system design made a lot of sense when a property was first built, but as that landscape has evolved over time, beds have changed, trees have grown, it may no longer make a lot of sense and it may need to be reevaluated by an irrigation professional. We may also see improperly scheduled practices. So it's not unusual for me to see folks watering at the wrong time of day, the wrong time of year. We see a lot of folks that continue to water on a very regular basis during the winter, which is completely inappropriate. And so we'll talk about that. We'll see wrong frequency and duration. And some of this is being driven by just confusion around what is the best management practice, confusion around what is appropriate in relation to other things that may be going on with our property. So we'll try to get to some of these things today. And then the other thing that we'll see sometimes is just a lack of routine maintenance, right? So you can think of, your sprinkler system as an asset, very similar to having a vehicle or having other things where there's considerable investment. And for us to really make sure that that continues to operate and function properly, we have to get into some kind of regular maintenance routine with it, because these components are not going to last indefinitely without some care, some updating, some repairs. And we'll see, unfortunately, very often that folks, and people get busy with life, and it's easy for us to kind of ignore this and not pay attention to it. And then we may see that we've got subsurface leaks or heads that are broken and we don't even know they're broken. And all these things can lead to inefficient use of water, which costs us money, and also means that we're wasting some of our precious water in Texas. Now, as you go forth and you look at, what are some of the watering recommendations? How much should I be watering my turf grass lawn? You'll find a lot of conflicting, confusing information depending on which rabbit hole you go down on the internet. But a lot of times what we try to base these recommendations on is something called evapotranspiration. And in the very simplest sense, it's this idea that when I'm talking about a lawn, and I'm putting that lawn in the context of heat and wind and humidity, there's going to be water loss that occurs. And that water loss is going to occur in part from the soil and the surrounding surfaces, and it's going to occur in part from the turf grass itself through a process called transpiration. So just like we sweat to cool ourselves, plants take up water and transpire water to cool themselves and to support many of their physiological functions within that plant. So what we try to do is take weather data and environmental data, and we collect this data all across the state of Texas, and we try to estimate what is that water loss that's occurring based on environmental conditions in each of these geographies, and how does that translate to how much I should actually be watering on a given week to replace what's being lost. Okay, and you can imagine that that's going to change over the course of the year, depending on how warm we are, how humid we are, what wind looks like, how much precipitation we receive. And there's a lot of thought and a lot of math that goes into trying to calculate these estimates. And what I'm going to share with you here, these are some data where I've taken historic or average data from our Texas ET network, which is a public resource that's available to you. It's just texaset.tamu.edu, or you can just Google Texas ET Network. And I've taken average historic data for some of these North Texas areas. And I've looked at, what is the historic ET or losses that we may see in response to environmental conditions? What is the historic effective rainfall? So what am I talking about there? So we get rainfall. We know the average precipitation rate for each month of the year. We estimate that only about 50% of that is actually available for plants to take up, right? So think about the rainfall we get here in North Texas. We know that a lot of that tends to run off because it's so heavy, so intense, and we're so near these impervious surfaces. So we tend to estimate only 50% of that is available to be factored into these equations. And then we have what's called a crop coefficient, where we kind of think about specifically for warm season turf grass, how much are we really needing to replace of those losses based on what we know about warm season grasses. So what I'm showing you here is in inches, you're looking at estimated weekly watering requirement for each month of the year for these various cities. So the Dallas-Fort Worth area is in green here. So you can see that really where we tend to get a little bit concerned is just going to be these 4 primary months here. Now, this can vary from year to year, as we know, where we may have very dry Septembers, or we may have very wet Septembers, or we may have very dry and warm Octobers, etc. But based on historic data, here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, there's only 4 months of the year that I typically recommend folks actually automate their irrigation.